Hello everyone, I'm Tim Selby here at Heart of Steamboat. Thank you for joining me as we've been working our way through the final week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem, going through day by day, primarily drawing out of the Gospel of Mark. Now today is a little different than what I typically do. This is a little bit more like class. So I'd invite you if you want to grab a Bible. You can follow along if you want. I'm just going to kind of walk through day 2, this day Tuesday in Jerusalem. And so I'm going to begin, if you want to follow along, in Mark chapter 11 at verse 27. Now just to review, Jesus comes into town, into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and then that evening he leaves. Then he comes back on Monday morning, goes to the temple where he overturns the table, throws everything upside down, calls upon the words of the prophets, saying, these sacrifices aren't really what I ask of you, but what I ask of you is sacred living, to care for one another, to let justice roll, to pay attention to the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien, to live in a sacred way. And then after causing that stir in the temple, that evening, on Monday evening, he leaves once again. Now we pick up on Tuesday morning when Jesus comes back into Jerusalem. Mark 11, verse 27. It says, again, they came to Jerusalem. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him. Now they come to him and they want to challenge him. They say, by what authority are you doing these things? By what authority do you come into all this fanfare on Sunday? By what authority on Monday do you come into the temple and turn things upside down and act like you can teach the religious leaders? And Jesus says to them, I'll tell you by what authority I do it, but first I have a question for you. And he says to them, was John the Baptist, who came before Jesus, he says, was John the Baptist divine, or was he just human? Was he just another guy? And when Jesus asks them that question, they have to confer a little bit. They're struggling here. They say, well, if we say he's divine, then Jesus will ask us, why didn't you listen to him? Or why did he end up with his head chopped off if he was divine? But if they say he's just another guy, he's just a person, they don't want to say that because it says they're afraid of the people. Because the people thought John was a prophet. The people followed John and valued John. So they confer a little bit, and then they come up with this answer. They kind of go to Jesus and they kind of say, we don't know. And Jesus says, okay, well then neither will I tell you by what authority I do the things that I do. And what we see here right off the bat on Tuesday is much of what will characterize this day in Jerusalem, which is this banter, this back and forth, this questioning of Jesus, questioning of his authority, trying to trap him, a little dialogue back and forth. It begins here with the parable, what's called the parable of the wicked tenants, where Jesus goes on offense a little bit against these leaders. And the parable of the wicked tenants, I'm not going to read it to you, but it's a parable about some people who are given a vineyard to take care of it for the owner while he's gone. They're given something really valuable and important. But instead of treating it justly and rightly, those tenants become greedy and violent. And because of their greed and their violence, it ends up, the parable says, they will be destroyed because of their actions. And then as it gets to the end of the parable, these leaders realize that Jesus is talking about them. And then in chapter 12, verse 12, it says, when they realized he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him. But they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. They feared the crowd. This is a theme that happens early in this week in Jerusalem. They're afraid of the crowd of people. And then what we have, and the rest of here in chapter 12 is 3 stories of questions for Jesus. They ask him about paying taxes, they ask him about resurrection, and they ask him about the greatest commandment. They say to Jesus, they're trying to trap him with these questions. The first one they say to him, should we pay taxes to the emperor? And Jesus responds by saying, Why do you want to test me all the time? Why are you testing me? And he asks them that says, pull out a coin, show me a coin. And they pull out a coin, and he says, whose head is on that coin? And their response is, the emperor's. You see, in doing this, Jesus sort of shows them, oh, you righteous religious leaders, you are invested in this system of the emperor. You have those coins. You've bought into this system. You're a part of it. You're not aside from it, but you're part of it. He kind of exposes them in that way. And then he says, you're a part of this system, so give to the emperor what is the emperor's. But give to God what is God's. Well, what is God's? Everything, right? All of it. He says, yeah, you're in this system, but give to God what is God's. And it ends up by saying, and they were utterly amazed at Jesus. Then some Sadducees come to him. The Sadducees are a group of religious people who say there's no resurrection. They come to him and they ask him about the resurrection, saying there were 7 brothers who died, and they all had the same wife. This wife kept marrying the next brother and the next brother and the next brother. And they say to him, when she dies and goes to heaven, who will she be married to then? And Jesus tells them, in effect, it's not like that. It's not the same as that. And he uses the language, he says, they will be like angels in heaven. It's a beautiful statement in that afterlife. We'll be like angels in heaven. And then he quotes to them Moses in the book of Moses at the burning bush, says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is the God not of the dead, but of the living. He tells them, yes, there will be a resurrection. It won't be like things are now, but I am a God of the living. And he says these names of those who have died, but yet live, because life goes on. And then they ask him about the greatest commandment. And it's interesting, this banter has been a lot with scribes and the priests of the time. I want to read you actually this piece from verse 28. One of the scribes, here's another scribes, came near, and he heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him a question. So this scribe hears this banter going on, and he sees that Jesus is wise and answers these questions in an amazing fashion. So he wants to ask him a question too. And he says, which commandment is the first of all? And Jesus answered, the first is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And then the scribe says this. Then the scribe says to him, you are right, teacher. You are right, Jesus. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other. And to love him with the heart and with all understanding and with all one's strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, this is much more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now, if you watched last week, you remember this is what happens in the temple. This is what came from the prophets. This loving each other is much more important than all the sacrifices that the people make. When Jesus saw that the scribe answered wisely, Jesus said to the scribe, you are not far from the kingdom of God. It's a beautiful passage. God asks of us love and not sacrifice, but love and sacred living. I'm going to skip over to chapter 12, verse 38 here, when Jesus again goes a little bit on offense. He says this, as Jesus taught, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance, they say long prayers. They will receive a greater condemnation. So Jesus calls out those who do things for show, for ego, for power. And he says they devour widows' houses. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? And then he goes on to tell a story about a widow. He sets it up by saying they devour widows' houses. And then he says this. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called the disciples to him and said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more money in than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all that she had to live on." It's a famous and familiar story called the widow's mite. She puts in her very last coin, her last penny. And this woman, it often is highlighted about this story, this woman, her giving is amazing. It's stunning, actually. But what not is often talked about this story is another way of reading it, and that is this. He just talked about devouring widows' houses and then shows a story where a widow puts in her last penny. And I think it's an indictment here as well of the faith community. If the faith community was doing their job, this woman would not have been down to her last penny. And she would not have had to put her very last coin in the treasury. Remember the prophets we talked about? They called upon the people, and Jesus called upon those prophets. And what they said is what we want from you, what God wants from you, is justice and to care for the poor, the orphan, the alien, and the widow. The widow as one who would have no way to provide for herself. It's their job to take care of her. And yet she's putting her last coin in the treasury. I think they have failed her. They have failed her as a faith community because their job was to support that woman, to lift her up, to make sure she wasn't out of money. And I think it's important that we as a faith community keep that in mind as well. Our call, not to just serve our own needs or do our own thing, but to make sure we lift up those who cannot lift themselves. And then he comes out of the temple. And one of his disciples said, "Look, teacher," as they look at the temple, "what large buildings." And then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another, and all will be thrown down." And then it says, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, and it goes on to tell some more stories here. And this picture behind me right now is the view from the Mount of Olives towards Jerusalem in the modern day. It's where Jesus sat and looked back and taught them. And when he continued to teach here in the chapter of 13, he taught what's known as the little apocalypse. Now, the big apocalypse is in the book of Revelation, the second coming of Jesus, the end of things, and all this that goes on there. Here in Mark, we have what's known as the little apocalypse, where Jesus teaches some apocalyptic things. Now, I think to understand what's happening here, we have to realize that the Gospel of Mark was written somewhere around 70 AD. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem overrun, the temple burned down. In the year 66, the war between the Jewish rebels and the Romans broke out. And Jerusalem became the center of that Roman rebellion. And those Jewish rebels in Jerusalem were able to hang on for 4 years before they were overrun and the temple destroyed. And so here, right at this time when this gospel is written, all this is happening. We're not quite sure if the Gospel of Mark was written just before the destruction of the temple or right after, but somewhere right in this time. So when all this is happening, we see these words of Jesus that seem to foretell the end of the world. And I think what we see here is what was happening in that place, in that time, for the writer of the Gospel of Mark and what we call the Markan community. They were in a time when they were being overrun, a time that would have felt like the end of the world, a time that would have felt like the whole world was closing in on you, destruction, violence, the end of life as you know it. And yet in the midst of that, they still have hope, a hope in Jesus. And that hope for them was that Jesus was going to return very soon and make things different. I think we know that didn't come to fruition. But that hope in Jesus carried them through, gave them strength, upheld them in the midst of this time. And at the end of chapter 13, which is the end of Tuesday in Jerusalem in the Gospel of Mark, we hear these words. And Jesus says to them, "And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." Keep awake. And what I hear in that is not keep awake because the end is near. It's not keep awake because the return of Jesus is coming tomorrow. I hear this, keep awake, because life is short. It's precious. It's fragile. Every moment matters. Every day matters. Don't fall asleep on what really matters. Don't fall asleep on our call to care for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the alien. Don't fall asleep on the reality that we need to love one another along the way. Don't fall asleep because when you're in cataclysmic times, when it feels like the end of the world for you, that hope in Jesus can carry you through and give you strength to move forward. Keep awake because it's so important and it matters so much. And that is the end of Tuesday here in Jerusalem. That's the final piece of that day. So what I think we hear in this gospel on this day is some really important things. And some of the highlights for me are the greatest commandment: to love God, to love others, to love ourselves. There's nothing more important than that. And that's really what God asks and wants from us. I also hear this importance of taking care of those who can't take care of themselves, of lifting people up, so a poor widow doesn't end up with absolutely nothing because the faith community turned away. And then to stay awake and alert, because we have a lot of work to do, a lot of blessing to share, a lot of light to bring in the world as we carry on this ministry of Jesus in our day, in our time. A lot happens here on Tuesday, and I hope we hear these words. And I appreciate your joining me on this journey. I hope when we get to Easter, we'll know how we got there. We'll know what it means and what it's all about, and it will lift us up and inspire us all. Grace and peace be with you.